One plant said, I'm hesitant here, but I'll make a deal with you. You treat me as an equal, and you share what I communicate to you. We're used as an antibiotic for trees. We keep the trees healthy all over this planet, for example, right? So there is this potential for a very deep and open and living, intelligent communication relationship between humans and plants in that regard. And cannabis definitely falls into that category.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Sabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got another great show in store for today. But before we dive in, I want to remind you about our weekly contests that happen over at Savannah Spirit. It happens every single week, which means you can enter every single week. There's $100 gift cards for SavannahSpirit.com. So go and check out www.savannahspirit.com/contests and enter in every week, and you'll be entered in for the amazing prizes. Now, our show today is all about spirituality in cannabis. Our guest today is Stephen Gray. He is a teacher and author. He wrote Returning to Sacred World, a spiritual toolkit for the emerging reality, and he was the editor and co-author of Cannabis and Spirituality, an explorer's guide to an ancient plant spirit ally. Excited to have him come on the show today and talk with us. Stephen, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, we're really excited to have you. Could you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you've done a lot of work, a lot of shamanic work in your past. Tell us a little bit about the work that you do and how you got into it.
Yeah, well, now I could give you several different versions of that, with shorter, longer, medium. But really, I'd like to, give a nod to the generation that I grew up with, so-called baby boomers. But for me, it was more the counterculture, is what we called it at the time. And so there was an explosion of interest in Eastern spirituality, and it paralleled an interest in the psychedelic substances. In particular, LSD was the main one at the time. But cannabis also was a big part of that culture, and part of its alienation from the so-called mainstream, or the, quote, straight world, as we called it. We called ourselves the freaks, actually. The term hippies was sort of like a derogatory term used by so-called straight people at the time. The counterculture people themselves often referred to ourselves as freaks. Call yourself as a freak was actually a badge of honor, because you were a freak to a culture that you thought was freakish, if that makes sense. Yeah. Anyway, I got interested in the psychedelics back then and their spiritual potential to some degree, but there was a common meme or theme around at the time, which was you've opened the window, or you've had an experience of divinity, or beyond ego or whatever. Now what do you do? And the idea that was floating about amongst the counterculture at the time was you had to ground it into your daily experience somehow. And so for a lot of people, that became some kind of spiritual tradition. And for me, that was Tibetan Buddhism, which I got involved in and was involved in for about 20 years. And then the psychedelics kind of went on the back burner for that whole period of time until the infamous Terence McKenna came to my attention. Do you know who Terence McKenna is?
Yes, and you talk about him too in terms of his advice. What was it? Sit down, shut up, and
pay attention.
Yeah,
somewhat inelegant, but appropriate. It was Terence McKenna's ideas that got me reinterested in the psychedelics, because he connected up the spiritual use of them, to what had been going on before. Because as he himself once said, that he thought the 60s were mostly misplayed, that a lot of people deliberately avoided and were afraid of the ego dissolving potential of those substances. Mm-hmm. So McKenna pointed out to me that there was thousands of years of history in indigenous cultures that had used these substances spiritually. And so that got me reinterested. One thing led to another. I was interested. McKenna had this thing about, sit down, shut up, pay attention, do it in silent darkness alone with heroic doses. He's talking about mushrooms there. I had a couple of experiences that I didn't think went that well doing that. And so I thought, there's another meme around that you should deal with a guide, you should have a knowledgeable guide in a container. We now call it set and setting. Actually, that goes way back. Timothy Leary came up with that one. McKenna wasn't so big on setting in that sense. So that led to me finding the Native American Church in the early 2000s and with their peyote ceremonies. And I was deeply impressed with the way those people ran ceremonies. They created an amazing, powerful, safe container for working with the medicines. And so that was very inspiring. And then I got involved with co-organizing this conference in Vancouver, the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. And that led to me meeting a whole bunch of different people. And I've also, experimented, so to speak, with other psychedelics and been involved with ayahuasca as well. Currently, I've connected, I'm not a full member exactly, but I'm sort of like a guest friend or something of a Santo Daime church group here, there at Ayahuasca Using Church. And very pleased with the way they create a container as well. So I got involved with this conference, and that led to me meeting a lot of really interesting people. And somewhere in there, I started thinking that while cannabis was spreading its wings rapidly around the planet on a number of levels, there was one aspect of its use which wasn't really being talked about except in some niche corners, which was the spiritual use of the plant. And yet I had read enough to know that that use is ancient and widespread on this planet. And so I thought it was not being taken care of properly. And it occurred to me to do something about that. But I didn't think I had a whole book in me to do it myself. Like, I didn't know enough to do that. I'm not a scholar of cannabis, and I didn't want to write an academic type book anyway. I wanted to just point. I'm more like I think of myself more as a teacher, so I wanted to educate people. So I was having a conversation with Kathleen Harrison, who you might know was married to Terence McKenna for 15 years. So she was right in the heart of all that. But nonetheless, she's a wise and very intelligent woman, and I have a lot of respect for her. And I told her about that, and she said, well, I think that would be a really important book. And if you go ahead with it, I'll contribute a chapter to it. And the light went off for me, and I just decided to go for it, and ended up with 17 contributors, plus myself altogether. For that purpose, to kind of, re-honor and reclaim cannabis as a spiritual medicine.
Well, it's interesting times right now too, especially. I mean, you're in Canada, but here in the States, where there's a lot of legalization measures happening at states. I live in California. California just legalized recreational use in certain. It's still a little murky in terms of how everything's going to work out there, but. I think it's important, especially now with this growing legalization, that there is this sacred in there, which is one of the reasons why I am so excited to talk with you today. Could you perhaps, though, give us a basic historical context? I know there's a lot. I mean, each one is probably a rabbit hole to go down in and of itself, but just a basic container of some of the historical use amongst various cultures in our history that have used cannabis in a more spiritual manner.
Sure. And by the way, I'd like to mention, it sounded like maybe you don't know that Canada is about to go full legalization at the national level. So we're about to sort of leapfrog you guys completely in that sense.
Yeah.
They're going to table the legislation in April, I believe, and we're going to have full across the board legalization for all adults sometime within the next year. It's going to be implemented. Yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, yeah. So it is a very exciting time. Yes. Well, that's not my specialty particularly, and that's why I put Chris Bennett's chapter in there, because he's a scholar of that sort of thing. And even though he doesn't cover the whole world, as it were, he focuses more on Asia. The general agreement is that cannabis was first showing up in human civilization in some area that's part of northeastern China at this moment. And its spiritual use is not really separate from all those other uses. I'm finding out more and more as I go. Right now I'm reading a book called Cannabis and Culture, which is a out-of-print book. It's a collection of papers submitted to, or perhaps read at an international conference in 1973 by some very serious academics. I noted that Chris Bennett got some of his material from some of those people, like a woman named Sula Benet, Benet, right? She was writing back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, mostly. These people did serious research on it. I was kind of not quite amazed, but really, surprised to see how endemic the multiple uses of this plant have been for a very long time, all over the place, all through Europe, all through Russia, right over to Siberia, to China, Asia, all those areas. Goes way, way, way back. China, as far as what we have on record, the Chinese record is probably the earliest. But we also have some archaeological evidence that cannabis was used by the shamans of the Neolithic era, as old as 7,500 years ago. There's findings in Ukraine and other areas of seeds and other residue that has somehow managed to stay there in the grave sites, China doesn't show any particular... I would think that, people would have discovered the mind-altering effects of this plant right away, but the actual record doesn't show much other than the archaeological record until about 2,000 to 3,000 years before the Christian era. Then it started,
which is still a significantly long time ago.
Oh yeah, yes. We're not talking like something that came about from the hippies here or something, there's reference in the pre-Confucian era to cannabis. There's Emperor Shen Nung had some quote, I don't remember, that Chris Bennett likes to use, with something about how long-term use starts to develop the intuition and psychic abilities, and overuse, you can start to see demons, I think it says, something like that. One of my favorite stories, or not stories, but references, comes from Herodotus, who I believe was a Greek philosopher, writing sometime, 1,000 or 1,500 years, perhaps prior to the Christian era, about the Scythians. They're well known on record for their use of cannabis, and they used it in funeral rites, where they'd have it after the funeral. They'd have some kind of enclosed space where they'd throw a massive amount of it onto some hot rocks. And as Herodotus says, they would howl with joy. I always like that one. We could use a little howling with joy around here these days.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I was quite surprised too. I mean, I being around, I grew up in California, in Southern California, and I mean, cannabis has kind of always been around. But I've familiar with, at the very least, its use within Rastafarianism and Hinduism, but I'd never really known that it was in Taoism and even Buddhism. In Chris's portion of that book, he goes into some of those other areas, which I was quite fascinated to find that it has such a long record of use within all kinds of different spiritual traditions.
Oh, yeah.
You quoted Jeremy Wolf, who called cannabis the people's psychedelic. I was wondering if you could say why you think it's the people's psychedelic.
Well, I'll partly, refer back to what I just said about this, endemic use throughout the world, more or less. Places you might not have thought of that have had it. I mean, it's been in Africa for, I don't know. They don't know for sure, but they think that it sort of emanated from Ethiopia in the early Christian era and gradually spread throughout Africa. So there's a widespread, multiple understanding and use of this plant. Sorry, I got a little waylaid there. What was the question again?
Just why you consider it to be the people's psychedelic?
Oh yeah, okay, right. The people's psychedelic. Yeah, I use the term the people's plant. Well, because of what I was just saying, it belongs to the people. It doesn't require the hierarchy. It's one of the folk medicines. It's probably it's our most important plant. I think you could make an argument that it's our most important plant because it has so many uses and it's been around so long. And also in terms of this use of this phrase, the people's psychedelic, it's arguably safer to use without the same kind of intensive container that people like myself would strongly encourage for using the major entheogens. I wouldn't encourage. Well, I don't know. People are going to use psilocybin mushrooms on their own. I think ideally you're going to be using them in a container of some kind that's very protected and safe with knowledgeable people around. But ayahuasca, for example, has a long, long tradition of use in a safe, effective container. Cannabis, although as you and I both know probably, can be extremely strong in certain conditions and situations and uses and dosages, it's generally a lot safer and gentler than these so-called major entheogens. And I think it's something that people can learn to use. I think I made brief reference to that in my sections of the book, that people can create what Ralph Metzner called hybrid ceremonies, because there's no real existing traditions of that are particularly accessible to moderns of cannabis ceremonial shamanic use. Metzner was actually talking about mushrooms in the same context, and he was saying, encouraging people to create what he called hybrid ceremonies, where many of us have had, like myself, for example, I've had all these years of experience with Tibetan Buddhism and the Native American Church, and I've been around lots of different ways of creating containers. And so bringing what you already know about other traditions and other ways of doing things and creating new forms, new hybrid forms of ways of working with cannabis, I think is very acceptable, very safe, very doable.
Well, and so you mentioned set and setting earlier, which is pretty central, even though that phrase is a more modern phrase, but it's been central to most shamanic cultures as far back as we can find. How important, you're talking about, how we can start to create these hybrid ceremonies or these ceremonies ourselves to work more in sacred ways with the medicine. How important as just a fundamental foundational thing is intention when you're working with plant medicine?
Well, I think it's really important. There's an interview with two medicine shamans in the book, Sean Hammond and Steve Dyer. They're very experienced medicine people. They've led ceremonies with several different medicines for many, many years. And I've done a lot of meditation. They're just really steeped in spiritual practice, and they show it. I know them pretty well. I actually coordinate iboga ceremonies for them out here on the West Coast when they come over from the UK once a year. And I hang around, I assist at the ceremonies, and I just see the way they work. And they use cannabis when they're working. Like basically as soon as they get here, they kind of get into a zone with it. And it's not a dependency or addictive kind of thing with them. They tell me that they hardly use it at all at home around when they're with their families and all that. But when they come here, it gets them into a zone. And what Steve says, I think that's an interview that I did with them, is that intention is all important because his term was it energizes. My favorite term is I like to call it a non-specific amplifier. So it's a gift, it's a great gift, but it needs to be channeled. It needs to be handled and directed. So if your intentions are unconscious, or if they're at some level on the continuum between conscious and unconscious to escape, it'll exaggerate that. If you're having negative ideation, negative self-talk. It can exaggerate and put that kind of stuff out of all perspective, and it happens. I discovered years ago that I better not get into an argument with my wife while I was high, because I'd get very passionate about it, and I realized later that I'd gotten way out of perspective about it. But that same amplified energy, it's a gracious, generous, sort of neutral, in a sense, gift that if you can channel it, then that's where it becomes a spiritual ally, because it opens up the whole mind-body system.
Now, how do people that, let's say they've been using cannabis recreationally, how do people who want to start to get more intentional with it, whether it's just in the regular way that they're using it, or if they want to start to create, whether it's a hybrid ceremony that you mentioned, or just incorporating it into part of their spiritual practice, how do you encourage people to start down that path? Like, what sorts of things can they do?
Yeah, it's a good question, and again, it's a gracious plan, so it's very flexible. How one might go about that, and I don't think I have all the answers, and that's why I like to use this phrase, the people's plant. Because people can find out for themselves. So having an intention, as again, good starting point, right? I would say, at the very least, if you want to find out what the plant can do in its sort of most powerful, pure way, remove distractions as much as possible. You might just try sitting alone in your room. Kathleen Harrison has a beautiful chapter in the book called Who Is She? And one of the things she talks about in there is the more you respect the plant, the more you treat it, as an honored guest in your home, the more it will give you. And that's a kind of a theme that runs through all this as well. So, if you again, sit down, shut up, and pay attention, what I like to say is the more you can get yourself out of the way, the more the plant can show itself. So if you're constantly filling your mind and your external world with activity, with music on, television on, talking, to people, because it makes a lot of people more talkative, and I'm not judging any of that stuff. It makes music sound better for a lot of people, of course, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to find out what the plant can do in its most pure and powerful way, it's ideally, you're going to, at least part of the time you're spending with it, you're going to want to sort of sit down, shut up, and pay attention in a quiet environment without distraction. And it's a challenge for a lot of people. Like, some people can slide easily into kind of a non-thought sense presence, but other people, and actually I have to say that I'm one of those people, because I have a very active, creative kind of a mind, or I'm always dreaming up ideas and so on. It's very tempting and challenging to not just always go with that,
Where do you think that the actual strain comes into play with some of that as well, in terms of the differences between like indicas and sativas, and the actual type of work that those plants are more apt for?
Yeah, well, that's also a debatable issue because different people have different takes on it. And part of it, I think, is metabolism, I'm getting the impression, I'm no scientist, so don't really quote me too seriously on this, but that everyone's interior cannabinoid system, what's called the endocannabinoid system, is different. Some people's is more active and more developed, maybe have more receptors going on, et cetera, et cetera. So for some people, cannabis is more of a stimulant. For others, it's more of a soporific or a sedative kind of. And this is where the strains come in, but there's not just one simple answer. So for those that are not particularly familiar with it, many people now are, there's a continuum from, say, pure sativa to pure indica. There are two different strains of the plant, actually. The cannabis indica is a different plant to some degree. Looks different than the sativa varieties, comes from different parts of the world, etc. But almost everything that you're going to get now is a hybrid. It's somewhere in that continuum, right? Mm-hmm. So the general understanding consensus is that the strongly sativa strains are considered more of a daytime high. They're going to be more uplifting, oftentimes more energizing, almost more caffeinated, more likely to stimulate mental activity, etc., and that the strongly indica strains tend to be more soporific. Couch lock is a common term that's used in association with indicas. Your doctor or your provider is more likely to prescribe an indica if you need it for sleep. It'll help you get to sleep, etc. So it's a bit of a trade-off, perhaps, and different people come down in different places on that continuum. I find, and a lot of other people find, that a strain that leans a little toward the sativa side is better for meditation because it's more awake-like, right? The trade-off is that you may have to, depending on the kind of mind you have, you may have to work more. It might be more of a challenge to work with the tendency to be thinking more, right? Where some people that I've talked to seem to prefer an indica-leaning strain because it's more calming that way, and it's better for them that way. For me, that's more likely to bring on a more dozy, spaced out kind of quality that I don't like as much, Mm-hmm. So, it's referred to by some people, and I tend to see it this way, as an advanced spiritual medicine, even though cannabis is gentle oftentimes, to really know how to work with it, especially in stronger doses, but just in general, it takes, Joan Bellow talks about this in her chapter as well. It's not something that most people are going to discover overnight, in the same way that you don't just sit down and meditate for one time and go, oh man, I'm enlightened, right? Meditation is a lifelong practice. And that's what we're suggesting as well, is that working with cannabis as a spiritual ally is also a lifelong practice. Joan Bellow talks about how it's a gradual reconfiguration or retraining, because when you can sit down, shut up, and pay attention with the plant, you start to tune in to your what Buddhists would call primordial or innate, unconditioned intelligence that's there already. The word Buddha just means awake, actually, right? And that's our true nature, our unforced nature. And what cannabis can do is tune you into that more, so that you learn to trust the messages of the body, the wisdom of the moment, your intuition, et cetera, rather than relying on secondhand calculations that the ego tends to, live. That part of us is the part of us that's always trying to figure out how to live and what's right and what's wrong and what's good and what's bad. And it's all in the head in some sense, whereas cannabis and meditation in general are a way to tune in to realize that we have that intelligence right now, right here in this exact moment, all the time. So that's how we work with the plant.
In terms of working with the plant, can you talk to us a little bit about your opinions on the various methods of intake or ingesting the cannabis?
Yeah, they are different, and lots of people know as much as I do just from their own experience about that. I would say smoking and vaporizing are essentially the same, except that there's evidence to show that there are a lot of irritants and particulate matter in smoked cannabis, which isn't in vaporized cannabis. So health-wise, it's probably better to vaporize. On the other hand, and this still needs a lot more investigation, I would say as well, but it's something for people to work with and experiment with. Some people, including people like both Sean and Steve that I mentioned earlier, feel that something is missing with vaporized cannabis. That there's Steve likens it to the spectrum of sounds in music, that some of the frequencies are missing, some of the higher frequencies are missing with vaporized cannabis. I think I might have experienced that a little bit because I do both. I have a water pipe that I use at home, and I have 2 or 3 different vaporizers that I work with. I like the idea of the clean, healthy aspect of the vaporizers, but I've sometimes noticed it seems like the cannabis is a little stronger and sharper if I do it smoke-wise. So, but that also leads into, particularly in regard to health, I would say that also leads into frequency of use, which we've kind of gotten close to talking about today, but not really, because it comes up in the book from several people. I want to make clear that I don't judge people. I don't have any judgment for, people that use it daily. I would just hope that they're in control of it and it's not in control of them. However, there's a common theme that if you use the plant less frequently, it's going to have stronger, sharper effects. Mariano da Silva, who one of the writers in the book, said that, cannabis has a transcendental effect, but that if he uses it every day, he loses those kinds of effects completely, altogether. So he tries to keep his use down to approximately once a week, and then he lives in the jungle in Brazil, and he said, I'll go for a walk in the woods and do what he calls special meditations, that kind of thing. The only other way he says that he uses the plant is he also says that it's good for when you've got some serious things to talk about. It'll bring out some insights that, like with your small group of people that have a serious issue to deal with, it'll bring out some insights that weren't accessible otherwise sometimes.
Now, so in places like India, where they've got like bong lassis and things like that, where they're essentially smoothies that have cannabis infused into it. What about the cultures that have a history with ingesting it, with eating it instead? Where does that kind of fit into the more sacred use of the plant?
Yeah, well, yeah, interesting. Yeah, we haven't quite got there. I was still back on smoking and vaporizing, but there's also sublingual intake as well, which is an interesting way to do it. If you divide it into two categories, inhalation versus ingestion, sublingual is in the ingestion category. But it's a little different because if you put some tincture, for example, into the front of your mouth in the mucous membranes in the front of your mouth or in your cheeks, you may start noticing effects within 5 to 10 minutes, whereas oral ingestion generally can be up to an hour and a half to 2 hours before full effects come in. So in general, as many people have discovered, not always to their pleasure, as it were, orally ingested cannabis can be much stronger than, smoked or inhaled cannabis can be incredibly strong. People have intense spiritual experiences sometimes, ego dissolving experiences, and freakouts of one kind or another, panic attacks, all kinds of things on smoked or vaporized cannabis. But in general, the ceiling, especially once you're used to the plant, you can sort of smoke yourself silly and it'll only take you to a certain point, whereas there's almost no limit to how intense and oftentimes bizarre experiences can be with ingested cannabis. And there's a lot of literature about that. The Brits spent a lot of time in India back in the centuries prior to this one, and they like to write about things. So they go and they drink these bong lassies and they go, oh my God, the sound of a pin dropping sounded like 1,000 nuclear explosions, have you ever heard of the Hashish Club of France?
No.
Oh, they're very interesting. These were like leading intellectuals and artists in Paris in the 1850s. Charles Baudelaire, Émile Zola, a number of people were involved in this, and one of them had I think they mostly had it at the mansion of one of these really well-off people, and they had hash paste, these sort of balls, that they'd gotten from the Middle East somewhere, and they'd have a dinner and they'd plop these things into their coffee, and then they'd kind of repair to different parts of the house. And some of the descriptions are like, gargoyles coming out of the fireplace, or a fellow who tried to go up the main staircase and he claimed it took him 1,000 years to do 3 steps. The distortions can be extremely intense. And yet, again, it comes back to that's an advanced spiritual medicine, because if you can channel the energy, first of all, it's also important to say you really got to know what you're dealing with. Like titrating the dose, managing the dose is really, really important with ingested cannabis. Smoking, you can figure it out pretty quickly, right? Have a puff, wait 5 minutes and see what happens. But, you take some a brownie or a drink or whatever, you got to wait an hour and a half to 2 hours before you get the full effect out of it. And, and then there's nothing you can do about it then. You could be staring at the ceiling 5 hours later going, I wish these hallucinations would stop now. But again, potentially with stronger doses, if you know what you're doing, if you can handle your mind, if you can handle it, there's this potential for going deep into ego dissolution, into spiritual realms. I actually was asked this guy if he would contribute to the book, and he didn't want to for some reason or another. His name's Michael Aldrich, or Aldrich, and he's got a chapter in a book that I came across on the Mahanirvana Tantra, which was a tradition that flourished in around, I think, the 11th century or the 1100s. I think it was the 11th century in India, of tantric use of cannabis. And now talk about setting, extreme setting, so to speak. They would take a young yogin and yogini, and they would prepare them for weeks with fasting and meditation and guidance and so on. And then they would bring them together in the temple and put them together in, a sexual commingling, and they would drink the medicine. And the purpose was not to have a great sexual experience, but to join in union in the total ego dissolution into the divine. So, there are very intense possibilities with ingested cannabis. Yeah.
So earlier when we were talking about you were talking about the people's plan, and that one of the reasons why you call it that is because people can work with it however it is that it makes sense for them. But another topic that you get into in the book is group ceremonies with cannabis. And I want to kind of touch on that for a moment. And of course we could say like, oh yeah, it will work. Just kind of figure out what works for you. But if you could create a template or a basic framework for people who are interested in wanting to create a group ceremony and really get into a more cohesive spiritual experience for themselves, how do you recommend people go about that?
Yeah, well, sure. Good question. But first of all, I'd like to say that there's something beneficial about doing any kind of spiritual practice in a group situation because of the shared energies involved and the shared sort of discipline. I used to do a lot of meditation in group situations, and you're not going to be tempted to sort of get up and give up on your meditation session in the middle as much as if you're off at the center somewhere sitting with 30 other people. So there's that discipline that keeps you focused right off the bat, right? And some other kind of intangible X factor that kind of energizes the situation as well. That's in any kind of yoga or meditation kind of scenario altogether. But so similarly with cannabis, of course. So in the book I wrote a chapter on it, and it was based on our own experiments over several years where I led ceremonies primarily with friends. And so, again, lots of different ways to do this, but what I wanted to do was get in there and stay there for a while with people. So we didn't just smoke vaporized. I had some candies at the time, which were carefully measured. They were 1/4 gram per candy from this one particular dispensary. And so we'd eat the candy right at the beginning. And then actually, a lot of the people were the same people over 3 or 4 different ceremonies. So I knew the dosage. I understood those candies really well. And I knew those people pretty well. So we didn't have to wait 2 hours before we could have a vaporized top up. The first time we did that, we waited 2 hours. But we wanted to make use of those 2 hours in the cannabis space once we got used to it. So once we got used to it, like half an hour later, then we had a puff to sort of thump it up. Yeah. So we made it into, as I mentioned earlier, this whole hybrid ceremony thing. I really like the way our Buddhist practice environments were created, where you start with like a gong and maybe have some prayers and chants and things, some dedications. You might do some sharing at the beginning. What's your intention? If you don't know the people or if they don't know each other, introduce yourself perhaps, or talk about, your experience, your previous experience with cannabis, whatever, not endlessly, but just briefly going around the circle. And then again, as I was saying earlier in our conversation, this idea of coming back to stillness and silence, inner silence, seems to be the gateway into unconditional awakening. So, and meeting the plant in that unobstructed or undistracted way. So, in my way of wanting to do it, I wanted to see how long people could sit with it and just do meditation. And I kept it really short at first, like little 10-minute sessions. And then I'd interrupt and do something like pass around some rosemary oil for them to sniff or something, or we'd do a little bit of stretching, or I play music. I do a chant or song on the guitar or whatever, or put some recorded music on for a few minutes, and just have these little kind of markers or breakpoints all the way through. But what I found with that particular group was they could sit for half an hour in silence, no problem. Thoughts are going to come up, but it's meditation practice. Thoughts come, thoughts go, thoughts come. And we found that worked really well. The first time I did that with this group of people, most of them had never used cannabis that way, and they were amazed. Really, they were delighted. Like some of the people in the group, there was about 12 people. Some of them had a more or less negative relationship with cannabis. They hadn't used it for quite a while. They had left it behind because they didn't like what it was doing in their lives, the way it was interfering with certain things, or the kind of ideation that was coming up for them or whatever. And I got comments from these people saying, wow, this is a totally different way of meeting this plant. It's an energy medicine. It's a gift that you have to surrender to and be present for and honor and let go into,
Shamanic cultures, in particular ones that work with plant allies and plant spirits, tend to really develop intimate connections with the plants, not even just in however they're using it ceremoniously, but throughout their lives. I lived in Thailand for a number of years, and my landlord, he was actually a fisherman, but he would come home, so he'd be gone for long periods of time, and then he'd come back, and most of the time he would just sit underneath his house and his version of the man cave, as it were, and he'd be smoking lots of cannabis. But the care that he took with it. So, he would sit down, and my little hut, I had to always walk past his house, and anytime I would be like, hey, because Ashton is hard for Thais to say. He'd be, hey, come, and go and sit down with him. And he would spend easily a half hour preparing everything. I think of people, especially that are using it recreationally in the West. They'll grab some cannabis, they'll grind it in a grinder, stick it in something, and go. He would lay it out. He also mixed tobacco with it, but he would lay everything out. He'd break everything up by hand. He'd chop it up. He would spend so much time and care touching it and being with it, so that it wasn't just like grab it, smoke it, done. There was a much deeper. He grew as well, so he spent time with his plants every day. I live in an area now where there's a lot of cannabis that is grown here, and you see the difference between people that are just kind of thinking of it as a cash crop, and other people that really have a deep spiritual connection with the plant as medicine and the way that they treat it differently. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of having a relationship with it, with actually like getting it in your hands? Or, I know that it's not realistic that everyone can grow it. As laws are changing throughout, the United States and in Canada, that becomes more accessible. But even then, not everyone can grow it. What are some ways that people can deepen their relationship, whether it's with cannabis or just plant medicines in general, to really get that intimate relationship with it?
Yeah, well, it's actually a really big question, Ashton, because it actually points at our relationship to plants altogether, and that actually points at our relationship to the planet altogether and to who we are. This term that comes up in spiritual teachings of oneness. It's not a frou-frou, new age woo-woo kind of term. It's an experience that people have experienced and understood, that we are not separate from all that is. That's not a dogma. It's not a belief. It's an experience. So I think our understanding of our relationship to plant and planet altogether is the central issue of our time. And I've been reading, different people's experiences with plants, and this is such a stretch for our culture. We've been put into a barren world. Western thinking in particular is, the scientific revolution and all that, and was it Descartes that said, the planet is mute, or some words to that effect. All matter, all nature is dead matter, right? And the experience of communities all over the planet outside of that cosmology argues differently, which is that the planet is alive in every respect. Have you ever heard of Stephen Harrod Buhner?
I don't believe so, no.
Oh, he's wonderful. His most recent book is just a doozy. It's called Plant Intelligence in the Imaginal Realm. But he's got about a dozen books, and one of his earlier books is called Spirit Plant Medicine, I think, or Sacred Plant Medicine. And he has these wonderful stories where he was healed from an entrenched abdominal condition that was driving him nuts, and nobody could figure out for a long, long time. No doctors could figure out. And when they finally suggested surgery, he said, "Okay, that's enough. I'm out of your world altogether." And a friend told him about a herb that native people from that area had used for abdominal problems. He took it, and it completely healed his problem, this intractable problem. And so he became fascinated by all that. And he started doing things like he first got to know the names and the lore about the plants on his own property. And then he would go and sit with them, like meditate with them, like sit down for an hour or two or whatever, long, long time, and start trying to communicate with them. And what he says is that the communication opened up, not just any kind of vague thing, but actual communication coming from the plants, where they'd say things like, "Well, we don't normally talk to humans. We don't have a lot of respect for you guys because of the way you treat us, But if you treat me," one plant said, "Yeah, I don't, I'm hesitant here, but I'll make a deal with you. You treat me as an equal, and you share what I communicate to you." And then it would say, "Okay, we're used as an antibiotic for trees. We keep the trees healthy all over this planet," for example, right? So there is this potential for a very deep and open and living, intelligent communication relationship between humans and plants in that regard. And cannabis definitely falls into that category.
Well, it's interesting too, because it sounds kind of far-fetched, someone's sitting down next to a plant and having a conversation with it. But if anyone were to go down to the Amazon, for example, and ask, the shamans with the ayahuasqueros, for example, well, man, how did you know out of all of the hundreds of thousands of plant species, how did you know? Because for people that don't know, ayahuasca is not just one thing, it's a combination of different plants. They asked them, well, how did you know to combine these two plants on a more chemical level? So you've got the DMT, which is usually in something like chacruna, which is a leaf, and then the ayahuasca is actually an MOA inhibitor, so it prevents the breakdown of these things. I mean, the chances that someone would just stumble upon this, I don't know what the figures are, but they're probably pretty astronomical. When anthropologists would go down and ask, well, how did you know that these two plants went together? The shamans would just look at them kind of like they're crazy, and they're just like, well, the plants told us. So just kind of matter-of-factly, and anyone that does, I would say, work with these different types of medicine, especially in natural environments. I mean, it's not something that our Western rational mind really likes to admit is possible, but the experience itself just speaks for itself in that case, where it happens. And I think there's a lot of potential and possibility there with working with these medicines to really understand the plant kingdom so much more.
Well, it just shows. I mean, it's. We're talking about how deeply conditioned we are into the rational reductionist mode of treating the world as dead matter, essentially. Yeah, absolutely. There's in my first book, I quoted a Peruvian shaman who said something like, "We don't disavow Western scientific medicine. It's just that we recognize it's only half of the picture. The other half is the spirit of these plants." And as you were saying that, I was even thinking of tobacco, and I think there's perhaps a developing conversation. I would hope there will be a developing conversation about tobacco too, because tobacco is also a sacred plant, and the shamans say that they have talked to the spirit of that plant as well. Kathleen Harrison, as I referenced earlier, writing in our book, Cannabis and Spirituality, she also spoke at our conference last year, the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, and one of her 2 talks was, in fact, on tobacco. She called it the Twilight Ally. So there's a potential for a radically different relationship with tobacco as well. And it would be an interesting thing to see because it is so widespread, of course, but the way it's used, and the way it's produced and so on, absolutely doesn't encourage that. But I still didn't get a chance to answer something you were actually asking a little while ago, which was about, the attitude toward it, right? I wanted to say that one of the chapters, and I wanted something in about this in the book, is by somebody, he's using a handle LLP because he's been an illegal grower for the last 30 years or so. He didn't want people to know who he was because it's still illegal in this country. But he says that you were saying people, not everyone's going to grow their own medicine, but a lot of people are now. Like many, many, many thousands of people are growing it, and many, many, many more will be. And in fact, Colorado, Washington, and I'm guessing California also are allowing people to grow up to 4 or 6 plants or whatever.
With the new law in California, they're going to make it up to the counties to decide.
Okay, yeah. But people are going to be growing their own a lot more, just for economic reasons, if nothing else. So what this particular LLP, the handle he goes by, says is that your attitude toward the plant at every stage, from beginning to end, will make a difference to the end result when somebody smokes it or whatever. And he says his friends have confirmed that with him for years, where they'll smoke his stuff and go, wow, there's just something about this that we're not finding in other things. And he said the first thing is to love the plant. It would be, not a complicated concept, right? Mm-hmm. But, love them, love what you're doing, look after them like living beings, treat them with that sacredness that, Kathleen Harrison talks about, as an honored guest, and communicate with them to the extent of your ability, but look after them lovingly and carefully. And I've heard other growers say this as well, that they also work with the cannabis plants that way. And they claim that their medicine is sweeter, purer, cleaner, less likely. Sean and Steve say that even the paranoia factor, which we could talk a little bit about on a psychological level if we have time, but even the potential for paranoia differs depending on the energy that was put into the growing of the plant.
Well, and I'm not familiar with anything specific with cannabis, but I'm pretty certain there's been studies done that look at the effect of communicating, i.e. talking to, as well as touching plants regularly, and the effects on their growth and overall health. And it shows that, the more time that anyone growing anything spends with their plants, physically touching them, talking to them, it helps the plant with its health and its growth, which again, obviously that would transfer over to anyone that's working with cannabis as well.
Well, I don't know how to define it, and obviously I'm not an expert on it, but there's something going on here that has been completely hidden from the modern mind, which is it's not as if each individual, obviously one plant doesn't have what we would call a brain, right? But somehow there's an intelligence, like the spirit of that species or whatever. They've done a lot of studies that show how plants function differently when in different environments. Like they put, this one study, they put a bunch of these one particular kind of plant together and no other species around it. and their growth pattern was very, very different than when they put other species around. It was like a clan system. It's like, we got to help each other. So they grew roots faster, that sort of thing, There's a book that's getting a lot of attention these days. I think it's called The Hidden Life of Trees or something like that. European guy who was a forest manager for many, many years. He's got some wonderful information in that book. I've forgotten his name right now, but he talks about, he worked in a beech forest, very large beech forest where the trees were growing in all kinds of different terrain and conditions, some getting more sun, some getting more water, some colder, warmer, some on rocky slopes, etc. And what happened over a period of time in this particular beech forest was that the trees that were vigorous started sharing their nutrients with the trees way, way distant that were in more difficult growing circumstances. And they do that through their root system connecting to the mycelial network of mushrooms that connects them to the next trees and so on. So there's this interactive quality in the mushrooms benefit because they're getting nutrients from the trees, and they're able to send nutrients and Lord knows what else, even communications to far-flung trees in their forest. And the result over time is that all the beech trees start growing and developing at roughly the same pace and level. It's just remarkable. And there's so many stories like that now,
Well, I think there's some pretty powerful medicine right there for humans to learn about how we support each other's growth instead of try to pull resources from other people so that we can grow taller. It reminds me too, there's another book called The Secret Life of Plants, which is an older book that really gets into some fascinating stuff with how plants interact and what we could call, for lack of a term, because they don't have brains or nervous systems as we know, but plant consciousness. And I mean, those are whole other rabbit holes to go down. And I'm looking at the time here and realizing how fast it has gone. Perhaps we get you back on again and we can dive down that rabbit hole even more. But tell us where people can connect with you, where they can find out about your book and the work that you do and workshops or any sort of stuff that you got going on.
Yeah, well, I'll confess, I'm not really a marketer type person. And in fact, I have queasiness about some of the marketing techniques that people use these days, and a fellow told me a couple of days ago, he said, you should tell people on an interview like this, send me an email and I'll send you some unpublished, essay or something like that. So, maybe I'll do something like that. So I will say that I haven't got an idea for that yet, but if people would like to write me and share their experiences or anything like that, maybe I'll think of something like that. And so they could write me at stephengraymedicine@gmail.com. That's STEPHENGRAY medicine@gmail.com. I have a website, and I'm also opening the channel there for people to submit posts, blog posts to that website, cannabisandspirituality.com. And similarly with a Facebook group, Cannabis and Spirituality, I would be very pleased if people would send me posts. I would approve them, of course, to make sure that they're in line with what I'm trying to communicate in general. But, it can be as simply as a testimonial of their own, like trip reports, as it were, And, again, being the people's plant, a lot of people have their own really fascinating and beneficial experiences with this plant. So, yes, absolutely. Please communicate. I'm open to being a kind of a central channel for sharing information coming and going.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today, Stephen. For all of our listeners out there, I hope if you have no experience with the plant, I hope that this chat today has opened up your mind to some possibilities and other ways of perceiving cannabis. If it is something that you use, I hope this inspires you to use it more consciously and deliberately in your life, and as perhaps a means of something to integrate into a spiritual practice or not. But thank you so much for listening. I hope you've learned something today. I hope you all have a very present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.